The soft hum of a radio filled the firehouse kitchen as Marcus Henderson poured himself a cup of coffee. At 36, Marcus was the kind of person people turned to in moments of crisis. Not just because he was a firefighter, but because of the calm, steady presence he exuded. Tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform fit snugly against his muscular frame, a testament to years of hard work. His deep brown skin glistened slightly from the morning workout he'd just completed, and his short, neatly trimmed beard gave him a look of quiet authority. Marcus was the heart of Fire Station 12, known affectionately by his colleagues as Cap, though he hadn't yet earned the official rank of captain. He had a natural ability to lead, always the first to volunteer for the riskiest missions and the last to leave the fireground. Despite his serious demeanor at work, he had a gentle smile that made people feel safe, even in their most vulnerable moments. The firehouse was more than just a workplace for Marcus. It was his second home. The smell of old leather couches, faintly burnt wood, and the constant aroma of coffee mixed with breakfast wafted through the air. The team had their rituals, morning briefings, endless banter over meals, and a camaraderie forged in flames. It was a sanctuary, yet outside its walls, Marcus knew a different reality. Marcus lived in the heart of Lincoln Heights, a working-class neighborhood on the edge of downtown. The area was diverse, but often tense, its vibrancy muted by economic struggles and deep-seated prejudices that festered in certain corners. Murals of community heroes and slogans of unity decorated crumbling walls, a reminder of the resilience of the people who lived there. Marcus had grown up just a few blocks away, in a small apartment where his mother had worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. She had always told him, "The world might be tough on you because of your skin, but you rise above it by being tougher and kinder." Her words had shaped him, fueling his resolve to protect and serve his community, even when it didn't always love him back. The day began like any other. After breakfast, Marcus checked the engines, ran safety drills with the team, and reviewed the station's maintenance log. He worked with a tight-knit crew: Diego, the easygoing jokester; Casey, the rookie with a lot to prove; and Chief Williams, who had been a father figure to Marcus since he joined the station. "Hey, Cap," Casey called out as they cleaned equipment. "Heard you're up for that leadership award next month." "Big deal, huh?" Marcus shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's just a nomination. Let's focus on today, not next month." Diego laughed. Classic Marcus. Can't even take a compliment without turning it into a pep talk. The camaraderie lightened Marcus's mood, but an unease lingered. It wasn't unusual for him to encounter subtle, or sometimes blatant, racism while on the job. Just last week, a man had refused to let Marcus into his home during an inspection, muttering something about not wanting strangers snooping around. Marcus hadn't reacted outwardly, but the sting of those words stayed with him. As Marcus adjusted his gear back in the locker room, he caught sight of a headline on his phone: "Neighborhood divides over redevelopment plans." The accompanying photo showed protesters arguing in front of City Hall. Marcus recognized one of them immediately: Harold Wallace, a retired factory worker infamous for his outspoken racism. Wallace lived just 2 streets away from the station and had a history of causing trouble, particularly for people who didn't look like him. Wallace had once called the station to complain about noise from those fire trucks after Marcus's team had responded to a late-night emergency near his home. Marcus had let it roll off his back then, but the man's name was a reminder that prejudice wasn't just a distant problem. It lived next door. Something about seeing Wallace's face in the news unsettled Marcus. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a nagging feeling told him that his path and Wallace's might cross again, and not in a way he would like. It was mid-afternoon when the call came in. The blaring tone of the alarm shattered the calm of the firehouse, followed by the dispatcher's voice over the intercom. "Structure fire reported at 415 Oak Street. Possible entrapment. Engine 12. Respond immediately." Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he registered the address. It was Harold Wallace's house. "Let's move," he barked, his voice steady despite the swirl of emotions building inside him. The team sprang into action, pulling on their gear and boarding the engine within seconds. Marcus sat in his usual spot near the front, his mind racing. He had saved countless lives before, but this call felt different. He couldn't ignore the irony or the weight of what lay ahead. As the fire engine roared down the street, smoke billowed in the distance, thick and black against the pale blue sky. When they arrived at the scene, flames had already engulfed the front of the house, licking at the windows and roof with a ferocious intensity. A small crowd had gathered, their murmurs drowned out by the crackle of fire and the wail of sirens. Diego was the first to notice the figure at the second-floor window, banging desperately on the glass. "We got someone up there," he shouted. Marcus squinted through the smoke and confirmed it was Wallace. The old man's face was pale, his movements frantic as he tried to signal for help. Marcus's gut clenched. "Casey, get the hose on the east side." "Diego, help me with the ladder," Marcus ordered. His voice betrayed none of the hesitation he felt. As they positioned the ladder, Marcus yelled up, "Mr. Wallace, stay calm. We're coming to get you." Wallace's face twisted into something between relief and panic. "Hurry," he coughed, barely audible over the roar of the flames. Marcus ascended the ladder with practiced precision, the heat growing more intense with each step. By the time he reached the window, Wallace was gasping for air, his hand clutching at his chest. "Put your arm around my shoulder," Marcus instructed, pulling the older man onto the ladder. Wallace hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting Marcus's. There was something in his gaze, fear perhaps, but also the faintest flicker of shame. The descent felt agonizingly slow, but Marcus kept his focus, steadying Wallace's trembling frame as they made their way down. The moment they reached the ground, paramedics rushed in to assess Wallace, who waved them off weakly. As Marcus removed his helmet and wiped sweat from his brow, he overheard Wallace mutter to one of the medics, "Took them long enough to get here." Marcus froze, the words cutting through him like a blade. After everything, this was the man's response? Diego glanced at Marcus, his expression darkening, but Marcus shook his head slightly, signaling him to let it go. Back at the engine, Marcus tried to focus on the task at hand, packing up equipment, checking on his team. But his thoughts kept returning to Wallace's words. No thanks, no acknowledgement, just another subtle jab wrapped in entitlement. Later that evening, as the firehouse settled into an uneasy quiet, Marcus sat alone in the common area, staring at the television without really watching it. Chief Williams entered, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Long day," the chief said, handing Marcus a cup. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "Sometimes I wonder why we bother, Chief. People like Wallace, they don't want us there, but they still expect us to save them." The chief took a seat across from him, his expression thoughtful. "You know why we do it, Marcus? It's not about who they are, it's about who we are. You didn't climb that ladder for Harold Wallace. You climbed it because that's what you were born to do." Marcus stared into his coffee, the chief's words echoing in his mind. He wanted to believe them, but the bitterness lingering in his chest wouldn't fade. As he walked back to the locker room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events were just the beginning of something bigger. The days following the fire felt like a blur. Marcus returned to his usual routine at the firehouse, but the incident with Harold Wallace lingered in his mind. The man's dismissive attitude, even after being saved from near-certain death, gnawed at him. It wasn't the first time Marcus had faced prejudice, but this felt different, more personal. The neighborhood, too, was abuzz with talk. Wallace's house had suffered severe damage, and while he and his family had escaped unharmed, the event had left its mark. Conversations at local cafes and barber shops centered on the fire, with many applauding the firefighters for their bravery. But whispers of Wallace's behavior spread just as quickly. A few days later, Marcus was scrolling through his phone during a rare moment of downtime when a headline caught his eye. Local firefighters' heroic rescue marred by controversy. Curious, Marcus clicked the link. The article recounted the fire at Wallace's house, but it also included a quote from Wallace himself. "They took their sweet time getting to me. I had to wait while the fire got worse." Marcus's stomach churned as he read the words. The article painted an unfair picture, implying negligence on the part of the fire department. Social media quickly picked up on the story, with comments ranging from support for the firefighters to criticism based on Wallace's accusations. Back at the station, Diego slammed his phone on the table after reading the article. Can you believe this guy? After everything we did for him. Casey nodded, his face flushed with anger. People are actually buying this? It's ridiculous. Marcus stayed silent, his jaw clenched. He knew reacting publicly would only escalate the situation, but the unfairness of it all made his blood boil. That evening, Marcus went to visit his mother, hoping her steady wisdom would help him make sense of his emotions. She lived in the same apartment where Marcus had grown up, a modest space filled with family photos and the comforting smell of home-cooked meals. Over dinner, Marcus shared his frustrations. It's not about the credit, Mom. I don't need to thank you. But to accuse us of not doing our job? To twist what happened like that? His mother, a woman in her late 60s with graying hair and a warm smile, placed a hand on his. Marcus, you can't control how people see you, but you can control how you respond. Remember, every action you take speaks louder than their words. Her advice was comforting, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the firehouse earlier than usual. He needed time to clear his head. The quiet hum of the station felt almost soothing as he sat in the garage, staring at the fire engine that had carried him to Wallace's house just days ago. He thought about his mother's words, about Chief Williams's reminder that their work wasn't about recognition. But it was hard to hold on to that perspective when someone like Wallace could twist the narrative so easily. Deep down, Marcus knew his frustration wasn't just about Wallace. It was about years of facing similar situations, being doubted, disrespected, and dismissed because of the color of his skin. He had always risen above it, channeling his anger into action. But this time, it felt heavier, as though the weight of it all was finally catching up to him. As Marcus sat lost in thought, Chief Williams entered the garage. "You're here early," the chief said, his voice laced with curiosity. Marcus looked up, his expression somber. "Just thinking." Williams took a seat beside him. "You know, Marcus, the hardest part of this job isn't the fires. It's dealing with people who don't understand what we do or why we do it. But every so often, you'll get a moment that makes it all worth it. What if that moment never comes?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Williams smiled faintly. "It always does, Marcus. Sometimes it just takes longer than you'd like." That afternoon, as the crew prepared for their next shift, another call came in. This time, it was for a structure fire on Elm Street, a small home engulfed in flames. But as Marcus listened to the dispatcher's report, his heart sank. The home belonged to Harold Wallace's daughter. Marcus grabbed his gear, his mind racing. This was his chance to prove, not just to Wallace but to himself, that his actions weren't dictated by others' opinions. No matter the circumstances, he would do what was right. The fire at the Wallace family's second home on Elm Street was raging when Engine 12 arrived. Flames consumed the roof, and thick smoke billowed from the windows. Marcus quickly assessed the scene, noting the crowd that had gathered. Among them, Harold Wallace stood near the curb, his face pale and streaked with soot. "What do we know?" Marcus asked the dispatcher over the radio as he stepped off the engine. "Two people reported inside," the dispatcher replied. Marcus glanced toward the house and saw Wallace frantically gesturing toward the second floor. "It's my daughter and grandson. They're in there," Wallace shouted, his voice cracking. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Diego, Casey, set up the hoses. I'm going in." The heat was almost unbearable as Marcus entered the burning home. Smoke obscured his vision, and the crackling roar of the fire made it difficult to think. He moved quickly, relying on his training and instincts to navigate the collapsing structure. On the second floor, he found Wallace's daughter, Emily, huddled in a corner with her young son. Emily was coughing violently, shielding Max with her body. "Emily, I'm here to get you out," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. Emily's eyes widened with relief as Marcus helped her to her feet. He handed her a breathing mask from his kit and carried Max in his arms. The stairs were beginning to give way, but Marcus moved swiftly, guiding them through the dense smoke and falling debris. The trio emerged from the house just as the roof collapsed behind them. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by cheers as Marcus set Max down safely on the sidewalk. Wallace rushed forward, his face etched with gratitude and disbelief. You saved them," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Marcus removed his helmet, sweat streaming down his face. He looked Wallace in the eye, his expression unreadable. "That's my job," he said simply before turning to check on Emily and Max. For the first time, Wallace seemed to falter. The man who had always carried himself with an air of superiority now looked vulnerable, humbled by the reality of what had just happened. Later that evening, as the fire crew packed up their equipment, Marcus noticed Wallace lingering nearby. The old man approached cautiously, his usual bluster replaced by an air of hesitation. "I owe you an apology," Wallace began, his voice trembling. "I've been wrong about a lot of things. About you." Marcus looked at him, his expression softening but remaining guarded. Wallace continued, "I've spent my whole life judging people for things that don't matter. But today you saved my family, even after everything I've said and done." Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of Wallace's words settling over him. "It's not about what you said or did, Mr. Wallace. It's about what's right." Wallace nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As Marcus returned to the firehouse that night, he felt a sense of clarity. Wallace's apology didn't erase the years of prejudice, but it was a step, a small but meaningful step, towards something better. The next morning, the firehouse was unusually quiet. Marcus sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. Saving Emily and Max had been just another day on the job in some ways, but the encounter with Harold Wallace lingered with him. He didn't expect Wallace's apology to erase years of tension or undo the hurtful words, but it was a start. And for Marcus, that small moment of acknowledgement meant more than he cared to admit. Later that week, Marcus found himself back in Lincoln Heights, walking through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. He passed by Wallace's rebuilt home on Oak Street and noticed the older man sitting on the front porch. "Marcus!" Wallace called out, surprising him. Marcus hesitated for a moment before walking up the steps. Wallace stood, holding out his hand. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, his voice steady this time. Marcus shook his hand, nodding. "Just doing my job," he replied. "No," Wallace said firmly. "It's more than that. You could have let my family suffer, but you didn't, and for that, I'm grateful." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply said, "I'm glad they're safe." Before he left, Wallace handed Marcus an envelope. "For the station," he said. "It's not much, but I want to contribute to the work you all do." Marcus opened the envelope later and found a check, along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for saving more than just our lives." Word of Wallace's gesture spread quickly through the community. People who had once viewed Marcus as just another firefighter began to see him in a new light, not only as a hero, but as a symbol of resilience and compassion. At the firehouse, the team noticed the shift, too. Diego clapped Marcus on the back during a briefing. "Looks like you've got a fan club. Cap Wallace is telling everyone you're the best thing to happen to this neighborhood." Marcus smirked. "Let's hope he remembers that the next time we roll out at 2 a.m. The laughter from his crew reminded Marcus that no matter how the world viewed him, the people who mattered most already knew the truth. That evening, Marcus sat on the roof of the firehouse, looking out over the city skyline. The stars were faint, dulled by the glow of streetlights, but they were still there, steady, constant. He thought about his mother's words, about the chief's wisdom, and about the small but meaningful apology from Wallace. Change wasn't immediate, but it was possible. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the cool night air wash over him. He hadn't chosen this path for recognition or thanks. He had chosen it because he believed in something greater, the idea that every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the power to spark something bigger. The next day, as Marcus prepared for his shift, a young boy approached the firehouse with his mother. It was Max, Wallace's grandson. The boy handed Marcus a drawing, a crayon depiction of a firefighter carrying a family to safety. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Mr. Marcus." Marcus knelt down, smiling as he took the drawing. "You're welcome, Max. And maybe one day, You'll be a firefighter too. As Max beamed up at him, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but moments like this reminded him why he kept going.